Imagine a single person who can only sleep once a week, and to keep the problem honest, we have to define that rule narrowly and enforce it without loopholes. This person is biologically human, not altered, not medicated beyond what is available to everyone else, and not allowed to fragment sleep into micronaps or chemically induced unconsciousness that conveniently avoids the word sleep. Sleep means the same thing it means for everyone else: sustained loss of consciousness with the usual neurological signatures, and it can only happen once every 7 days. They are otherwise ordinary in health, intelligence, and social position at the beginning of the scenario, and the world does not pause or adapt in advance to make the situation easier. At first glance, the advantage appears obvious and almost childish. One person has roughly 6 extra waking hours per day, which compounds into about 40 extra hours per week, which looks like an entire additional workweek hidden inside a single body. Early interpretations tend to assume productivity scales linearly with time awake, but that assumption collapses quickly once biological limits are respected. Human cognition is not a machine that simply idles when used. Sleep is not downtime, it is maintenance. Removing it does not merely free time, it creates accumulating damage, and the central question of the scenario becomes whether the weekly sleep is sufficient to reset that damage or merely slow its accumulation. During the first few weeks, the person functions unusually well. They experience fatigue, but not catastrophic collapse. Reaction time slows slightly, emotional regulation weakens, and memory formation becomes inconsistent, but nothing prevents them from working, learning, or socializing. The extra hours initially translate into visible output. They read more, work longer shifts, acquire skills faster, and become known as unusually reliable or driven, depending on context. Institutions respond to outcomes, not explanations, so employers, schools, or clients begin to lean on them in subtle ways, scheduling late hours, overnight coverage, or continuous tasks that others avoid. This is where the system begins to react. Labor structures are designed around limits shared by everyone. A person who violates those limits becomes valuable but also destabilizing. Managers do not rewrite policy for one exception, they quietly exploit it. The person is not promoted because they are exceptional, but because they are available. Over time, their role shifts away from creative or strategic work toward continuity work, the human equivalent of infrastructure that never shuts down. The advantage becomes narrow. They are always there, but rarely rested enough to be brilliant. Psychologically, the effects deepen. Sleep deprivation does not produce a steady decline, it produces distortions. Confidence rises as judgment worsens. Risk assessment degrades. Emotional reactions flatten or spike unpredictably. The weekly sleep becomes a strange anchor point, a kind of neurological debt payment where the brain attempts to repair 7 days of damage in one event. It is insufficient. Memory consolidation becomes erratic. Long-term planning suffers. The person can stay awake, but cannot stay aligned with themselves. Social norms adapt awkwardly. Friends initially admire the endurance, then stop trying to match schedules. Relationships strain not because of absence but because of mismatch. The person is awake when others are not, and exhausted when others are present. Shared rhythms break down. Weekends lose meaning. Nights become long stretches of quiet alertness filled with low-quality activity, because high-level cognition cannot be sustained indefinitely without rest, no matter how many hours are technically available. Healthcare systems eventually intervene, not out of curiosity but necessity. The person presents with symptoms that do not map cleanly onto known disorders. They are not insomniac, not manic, not narcoleptic, yet they exhibit traits of all three. Monitoring reveals that the weekly sleep does not restore baseline neurological markers. Damage accumulates slowly but unmistakably. The person does not collapse dramatically, they erode. Reaction times approach dangerous thresholds. Immune response weakens. Hormonal regulation drifts. At this point, the economic fantasy of infinite productivity collapses. The person becomes more expensive to maintain than to replace. They require supervision, medical accommodation, and restricted duties. Liability becomes a concern. Infrastructure systems tolerate redundancy but not unpredictability. A worker who might misjudge a situation at hour 130 awake is not a miracle, they are a risk. Institutions quietly reassign them away from critical functions. Governments notice only when a pattern emerges. If the trait is unique, it is categorized as a medical anomaly and regulated accordingly. If it appears reproducible, then it becomes a policy problem. Mandatory rest laws exist not for comfort but for safety, and they are enforced with indifference to individual capability. A person who can stay awake does not gain exemption from systems built to assume fatigue, because those systems are designed to protect everyone else from the consequences of one person's error. The long-term equilibrium is dull and unromantic. The person does not become a hyperproductive outlier reshaping society. They become an administrative exception. Their life narrows around managing their limitation rather than exploiting their advantage. Their extra waking hours fill with recovery, mitigation, and low-risk activity. The weekly sleep becomes a fragile reset button that never quite resets enough. In the end, the world does not reorganize itself around the absence of sleep in one person, because systems are not optimized for individual anomalies. They are optimized for predictable averages, and the person eventually conforms not by sleeping more, but by being allowed to matter less.